All right. It looks like we got a fair amount of people in. I'm sure people will continue to trickle in here. But Tom, you ready for me to get started, give my opening remarks, and then kick it over to
Colin,
you?
I'm ready to go. Thank you.
All right, all right. Well, thanks for joining everybody, whether you're watching on Zoom or on Facebook. We're so happy that you joined us tonight for Shootout at the Depot, how a 19th century Tucker County gunfight became a national news sensation, an online presentation by Tom Rod. Tonight's event is sponsored in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council and Friends of Blackwater. And I just have a few quick things I want to mention before we get started here. First of all, we will have a question and answer chat session at the end of this presentation, but you don't need to wait until the end of the presentation to ask your questions. We can just amass those during the presentation, so send them in while you think of them, and we'll get to them after the fact. And the Master Tom himself will go ahead and chat with you afterwards. So if you're on Zoom, if you move your mouse around, you should see a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So you can go ahead and submit your questions through that, and we will get to them after the event. If you're watching on a Facebook live stream, go ahead and just leave your questions as a comment below this live stream post, and we will get to that afterwards as well. The other thing I want to mention too, since this is sponsored in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, we do have a survey, a post-event survey that we would love for you to fill out after the event as well. If you've registered and are attending through Zoom, you'll get an email tomorrow with the link to that. And if you're watching on Facebook, we will be sharing the link to that post-event survey just after the conclusion of the event. So stay tuned for that, and please do fill it out. It helps us inform our future programs, understand how to get better, and continue to present quality online programming. So without further ado, let me introduce our host. Our presenter is Tom Rod. Among many things, he is a retired attorney, an author, and Friends of Blackwater board member, and he is our presenter for tonight's webinar. So without further ado, Tom, I will kick it over to you, sir.
Hi, Colin, and hello, everybody. And now, without further ado, and I always wonder, what is further ado? Oh, well, we don't seem to have any, so we'll go get into our program. I'm Tom Rod, and this is a photo of me engaging in my favorite pastime, picking the banjo. We'll hold on this image while I say a little bit more. As Colin said, I'm a member of the board of Friends of Blackwater, which is a conservation group that's based in Tucker County, West Virginia. And in this program, I'll be talking and showing slides about a famous shootout and a trial in Tucker County that took place in the 1890s. Now, I've selected about 75 images to help tell this story, and you will see by my choices that I'm interested in both the people of that era and also the technology and history of that era. I have a written script here, which I'm holding up, which to accompany the images, and you should see me reading from it most of the time, because if I start ad-libbing, we could be in trouble. I expect my talk will go about 35 minutes, which will leave time for discussion, as Colin said. Let me qualify myself as a lecturer on this subject. I am, as Colin said, an attorney, and I certainly can understand court documents, and I've even tried a few murder cases myself, but I am not a trained historian. Fortunately, and now we'll start looking at our slides, I can and do draw heavily in this talk on the historical research and writing of this man, the West Virginia University professor and historian Ronald Lewis. Here is Dr. Lewis, shown with his most recent book, which tells the story that I'm going to summarize. He may be watching this program, in fact, and if he is, thanks, Ron, for your excellent work. Any mistakes, of course, are my responsibility. And I also want to acknowledge Keith Guthrie, who wrote about this case in a newsletter for timber and railroad history fans called The Log Train. I hope to have Keith's article up on the Friends of Blackwater website fairly soon. Now we'll start with a little stage setting geography. The geographic scene for our story is Tucker County, West Virginia. And here's a close-up of Tucker County. You can see in the right third of the county, Canaan Valley, which stretches from the circle with the highway number 93 in it down to the left to the circle with the number 32 in it. Canaan Valley is an oval, bowl-like upland valley with about 40 square miles in area. Within it, there are extensive wetlands and the headwaters of the Blackwater River, which is blue in this slide, and it spills out of the valley at Blackwater Falls. At the town of Davis, the Blackwater is joined by Beaver Creek. Then the Blackwater River flows down through the Blackwater Canyon and eventually becomes the Cheat River at Parsons. The Cheat then flows north to Cheat Lake near Morgantown, and it joins the Monongahela at Point Marion. Now let's add a layer of technology and history to our geography, and we'll look at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was begun in 1828 to get goods from the west to the East Coast. Now, it's possible sometimes to zoom in on a section of these maps, and I think I just successfully did it. And if you'll look here in Cumberland, West Virginia, that's a sort of midpoint on the way out to Wheeling. So let's see if we can get out of that zoom in. This is the final B&O system, which was begun obviously in Baltimore and took a long time to get out to where it reaches in this map. Let's take another look. Here's a picture of me at the B&O Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, with a replica of one of their earliest railroad cars from the 1820s. And here's a great picture of where they completed the B&O line to the Ohio River near Wheeling in 1852. And another couple of images to appreciate the romance of this fabulous new railroad technology and what I wrote here is the exploding industrial age of steam. Let's look at two more images. The first is a drawing of an excursion on the B&O to Wheeling in 1859, and this was drawn by the famous West Virginia artist Port Crayon. This is a lithograph from Harper's Weekly, but even better than this, so you see the fellow waving his hand there, they're having a good time. Even better, here's the photo that the drawing was taken from. This was 1859. A bunch of sort of bohemian artists went out to the Wild West town of Wheeling from Baltimore and had a good time, wrote about it in the paper. Anyhow, that's setting the stage. Let's begin our drama. We've got a railroad in place. Let's go and meet the first of the cast of characters. Let me get back on my script here and meet the first person in our dramatic cast of characters. This is Henry Gassaway Davis. He was born in 1823 and he died at age 93 in 1916. He came up through the B&O Railroad and he became the station master in Piedmont, West Virginia, which is sort of out there near Cumberland, Maryland. Davis had a long and successful career in West Virginia and national politics after the Civil War. He was a U.S. Senator from West Virginia and a Democratic Party candidate for Vice President of the U.S. Davis used his political power and his connections to finance and build a railroad line heading south into West Virginia, starting from the B&O line at Cumberland and going down past Elkins. He purchased large acreage and opened large coal mines, all beginning in the 1880s. Here's a map that shows going south from Cumberland down to Elkins and even Webster Spring, the ultimate length of his railroad efforts. And I think I can expand on this one a little bit too, and we can see starting up here near Cumberland, going down through Gorman, Bayard, Thomas, Douglas. This is all the railroad lines that Henry Gassaway Davis envisioned and built to connect up to the B&O. And let's get back to our script here. Here are some loaded coal cars near Thomas, West Virginia. So Henry Gassaway Davis opened these large coal mines, and he also built the railroad to get the coal out of there. And I'm ad-libbing again, but there we are. And here are some of the hundreds of coal miners who lived in the Tucker County town of Thomas and nearby, who did the daily work that supported Henry Gasaway Davis's business operation. And here is a picture of the coke ovens, and there were 1,000 of these in Tucker County. Actually, some are still near our Friends of Blackwater office in Thomas. These were used to bake coal into coke, which was used for making steel in places like Pittsburgh. And here's Henry Gasaway Davis again on the right, and his brother, Tom Davis. When Henry was in Maryland or Washington or New York, which he was 99% of the time, Tom Davis ran the show in Tucker County for Henry, and the town of Thomas is named for Tom Davis. Now, although it was coal that brought Henry Davis and his railroad ideas to Tucker County, there was another valuable resource in Tucker County, a resource that forms the underpinnings of our story today. And what would that resource be? To answer that question, let's imagine when Henry gets on his horse and goes for a horseback ride throughout Tucker County over his thousands of acres, what does he see? The answer is he sees massive old growth forests, what some people call virgin timber, covering the county. Here's some more of that timber. Here's another image, and here's another. Now, these massive logs could be moved to a sawmill on crude railroads, but whenever available, water transport was much cheaper, and it was the preferred method. I put this slide in to remind me to tell you just for a second about the French-Canadian loggers who were imported by the first lumberman who built a sawmill in Davis in 1886, a fellow named Jacob Rumbarger. There was no one local in Tucker County who understood the craft of moving these massive logs on the water, and so Rumbarger sent for 27 French-Canadian loggers. And in 16 days, I guess they came down on the train, and in 16 days, they moved a whole winter's worth of logs on the Blackwater River to the sawmill at Davis. Bienvenue les Canadiens, bonne chance. Well, when those Canadians headed up into Canaan Valley, they certainly would have encountered this fellow, who is the second member of our dramatic cast of characters. His name is Robert Eastham. Robert Eastham was born in 1842 near Front Royal, Virginia, to a large, prosperous family. His father owned substantial land and more than a dozen slaves. In 1861, Bob Eastham joined the Confederate Army, where he rode with Mosby's Rangers, an irregular guerrilla-style force. After the Civil War, he went back to Virginia, and then he moved to Canaan Valley in 1876 in the new state of West Virginia. Canaan Valley was a real wilderness then. There were only 3 resident families besides Bob Eastham. He bought several hundred acres and he opened a general store. His wife was the postmistress. Eastham was a big, strapping fellow, and he owned more than 20 hunting dogs. The image on the right is actually from an 1880s Cleveland newspaper story about Canaan Valley and about what a character he was, an important character in that area. In 1883, Eastham timber for that first big sawmill operator in Davis, Jacob Rumbarger, and then in 1884, Eastham got the contract with Henry Gasaway Davis to clear land for the new town of Davis, which was then the terminus of his railroad. This is a photograph, I think, from 1885 of 1886 is another I see there of his logging camp. And here in this great picture is, on the top half of this picture, is what Davis, West Virginia looked like in 1885, thanks to the work of Bob Eastham and his crew. This, I believe, is how the nickname Stump Town came to be applied in Davis. I don't know that for sure, but at the bottom half of the picture is a fascinating contrast. That's Davis about 20-some years later. Enormous growth in the town, and we're going to talk about that. But Bob Eastham didn't just scout and log timber for Henry Gasaway Davis. To understand what else he did, let's just take another look at our local geography. After Henry Gasaway Davis completed his railroad to Thomas and Davis, he pushed on with his railroad project. He decided that the railroad would bypass the Tucker County seat then Tucker County seat of St. George. You can see it on the Cheat River, and would instead go down the Blackwater Canyon, following the Blackwater River to what was then a very small town called Parsons. And here's the historic marker that commemorates the decision to build his railroad grade down through the fascinating and fabulous Blackwater Canyon. And I just want to say the Friends of Blackwater as an organization began as part of the effort to protect this canyon, and that effort has really made a lot of progress, and we hope that you guys will consider joining Friends of Blackwater to help us complete this task. This is a picture of the original Tucker County Courthouse at the town of St. George. There was a huge political and legal fight about changing the county seat to Parsons. There was a move to do that, which was strongly supported by, you guessed it, Henry Gassaway Davis and his brother Tom. Now, in 1893, while a legal case about moving the courthouse was pending, the pro-Parsons crowd decided to take direct action. And guess who was at the head of the armed mob that marched on St. George? Here's a photo group. I think they're leaving Parsons in this photo, and they took up their weapons and went to St. George, where at gunpoint they took the county records, and here they are in St. George, and took them back to Parsons, pending in the state Supreme Court. If you look at the fellow in the center of this 1893 picture with his hands on his hips, I believe you will recognize the second member of our dramatic cast of characters, Robert Eastham. And we can see just from this next picture that the people in Parsons got right to work. This is the new courthouse in Parsons that they began and was completed in 1900, really just after the trial that we're going to discuss in just a minute. So now we've met two members of our dramatic cast of characters, Henry Gassaway Davis and Robert Eastham. Let's meet the third and final member, Frank Thompson. This is Frank Thompson's father, Albert Thompson. The Thompson family had operated sawmills and lumber businesses in New England for several generations. They were well-to-do people. They had their main business office in Philadelphia, and they sold lumber all around the country. In 1888, the Thompsons bought Jacob Rumberger Sawmill and Holdings in Tucker County. This is Frank Thompson, Albert's son, born in 1861. That's the same year that Robert Eastham enlisted in Mosby's Rangers. Frank went to Dartmouth College, and after college, he moved to Tucker County to help run the Davis Sawmill. Let's take a second and look at a couple images of the sawmill and related operations that grew up in Davis. Along with mills creating lumber, too, tree bark was used in tanneries for tanning leather, and scrap wood was made into pulp for newsprint. Here's another picture of Davis in this era. And in this next picture, you can see that the Thompsons had the best and largest equipment for the time, specifically bandsaws, which was a new technology that could handle the biggest trees. Can you see how the upright blade in the center loops over that drive wheel? It's a continuous loop of saw blade, and the log carriage on the right drives or carries the logs into the moving saw blade. At one time, there were over 200 of these bandsaws operating in West Virginia, and they were the state of the art for the lumber business. Here are some Thompson sawmill workers displaying the finished product, beautiful, flawless cherry and other hardwood lumber, ready to be sent on Henry Gassaway Davis's railroad to be used in fine buildings all over the nation. Now, the trees that became these beautiful boards were quite possibly cut on the slopes of Canaan Valley, maybe even from Bob Eastham's land. And Canaan Valley is where the trouble arose between Robert Eastham and the Thompsons, the trouble that ended up in the courtroom and then at the railroad depot at Parsons. This is an early picture of the Blackwater River in Canaan Valley. logging crews would skid logs down to the shore, and in the early days, they would simply wait for the spring flood to float the logs down to the sawmill at Davis. But fluctuating river levels were a problem. So the Thompsons got a license from the state to build what was called a splash dam to back up water in the river. Then they could control the release of the water and float the logs downstream when enough water and logs had accumulated. The Thompson Splash Dam was near where the current Timberline ski resort is in Canaan Valley, and I can still see the remains, I'm told. Here in this picture, not from Canaan Valley, but is a splash dam in action. And you can see how they lift up those boards, and then the water would carry the logs downstream. The Eastham-Thompson problems arose when Eastham's crew had cut a number of trees for landowners in the valley, and he needed to get those logs down the Blackwater River to Davis to get paid, to the sawmill to get paid. Eastham claimed that the Thompsons were keeping his logs tied up at their splash dam, and he wanted them to tear it down. He claimed that the license that the Thompsons had was unconstitutional. So the Thompsons went to court in Parsons, asking the court to keep Eastham from interfering with the dam. Let's look at one of the legal papers in that case from the Parsons courthouse record. And I had a great time going through these and taking pictures of the ones that were, very notable. There are lots of them. This is Bob Eastham, and I'll just read it. To the Blackwater Lumberman, take notice, you are hereby notified you have a log or boom across the Blackwater River, which has jammed and stopped and obstructed the river with logs that my pulp cannot pass, and you are not moving unless you open through said dam. I will put men on, etc. You are further notified, clear, etc., etc. So Bob Eastham was pretty ticked off, and he sent them this notice, and as I say, the Thompsons had went to court. So this is the fellow. I skipped a piece of paper here, but I think I'll get back on track. This is the fellow who was running the court in Parsons that the Thompsons went to seek protection from Eastham. And in May of 1895, Judge Holt granted the Thompsons a temporary injunction telling Eastham to stay away from the dam while the case proceeded. Well, Eastham was furious. He decided to take direct action. He had his workers shoot at Thompson's workers who were working at the dam. And then in the middle of the legal case, Eastham had one of his workers blow up the Thompson Splash Dam. And we have a photo of it, which is pretty remarkable. This is from the legal case, I believe, but it made it into the possession of one of the descendants of the Thompsons, and we have it to look at today. Eastham claimed in court, by the way, that he knew nothing about this blowing up, but unfortunately for him, his employee later confessed in court also. Now let's look at a couple more documents from the court records about this fight over the splash dam. This is Bob Eastham going off. I see the end, which is not far off. If I cannot enjoy the rights guaranteed to me by the Constitution of the United States and this state, I will die in the attempt fighting for my own. And then it goes on about the sale of the land. I mean, there were many, many different complications about Eastham's land. But as you can see, he sees the end. He is ready to die. Let's look at this next. Here's another one of his statements. Thompson and the Blackwater Lumber Company have sued out an injunction to prohibit me from using the river for floating my logs. Not one stick has gotten to Davis. I have to pay them. It took completely frustrated and pissed off. Well, this legal stuff, and now I guess I am ad-libbing, but it goes on forever, and there's huge piles of paper in the courthouse. But this sort of stands for what the result was, which is the judge telling Eastham to stay away from the dam, and Eastham being really mad. This is the temporary injunction bond. And let me get to my script here. Hope people are following along. I can't see this audience, so I'm just acting on faith here, and I'm a little nervous about this first presentation ever on Zoom, but appreciate your putting up with me. Okay, let's go to this injunction bond. I got myself back on the script. This is the old-fashioned antique pen and ink 1895 temporary injunction bond from Judge Holt's court, and he made it permanent in 1896. Now, to see the next step of our story, we're going to hold just for a second on this image, which, while we, in our minds, zoom out a little bit from the ongoing courtroom conflict about the splash dam. Let's imagine a wider frame for a moment, the rest of Tucker County, where thousands of people were living their busy 1890s lives in the bustling towns of Thomas and Davis and Parson, and the woods and mines and mills around those towns. Everywhere in Tucker County, as we have seen, there was logging, mining, railroading, and there was also the attendant human activity, working, eating, shopping, sleeping, and drinking, and loving. And as part of all this human activity, it so happened that the son of a friend of Bob Easton's, a young man named Carl Degler from Davis, found himself in 1897 in that same courtroom in Parsons, where, after due process of law, a jury of Carl Degler's peers found that he, Carl Degler, was the father of a child with a young woman in Parsons. And so Carl had to pay child support. Now, I don't have a picture of Carl Degler or the young woman of the child, so I hope your imaginations are working okay. For whatever reasons that we might imagine, Bob Easton thought that this jury decision against his young friend Carl Degler was neither fair nor right, and so, ever the man of action, Bob Easton circulated an angry petition among his friends in the Davis region, and he sent it to, you guessed it, Judge Holt. Judge Holt was not amused, and he ordered Bob Easton and all 65 petitioners to come down the mountain to Parsons for a contempt hearing on March 18th, 1897. Trained to bring the petitioners from Davis to Parsons. And at the contempt hearing, Judge Holt fined Bob Easton for trying to intimidate the court. And it happened that Frank Thompson was in the courtroom audience. And this is from the testimony in the later trial. The witness was asked, "What business do you know of Frank Thompson having in Parsons that day?" "Well, I don't know of any business he had." "Well, did you see him about the courtroom while the contempt proceedings were going on?" "Yes, sir." "What was he doing there?" "Well, he seemed to be enjoying what I called our misfortune, was laughing a good deal." It's great to find a document like this that so crystallizes the situation. So, after the contempt hearing, the petitioners, licking their wounds, as it were, Bob Easton among them, gathered at the Parsons Depot to board the passenger car and go back up the mountain. And Frank Thompson and his friend also had a ticket on that train. Perhaps they were still chuckling as they climbed aboard. Here's a picture of the train car, Western Maryland, of that era that they were riding on. Here is the interior of that type of railroad car. And I took this picture at the B&O Museum in Baltimore. Now, I've been flipping through these images pretty fast, but I'm going to hold on to this image for a minute while I talk about what happened in this railroad car at the Parsons Depot on the drizzling evening of March 17th, 1897. There must have been several dozen people in the car, and many of them testified in court later, and I will summarize what they basically agreed on. For starters, the evidence was clear that Bob Easton had told many people for more than a year that he wanted to settle matters with the Thompsons for the gunfight. And Frank Thompson was aware of these threats, but he didn't come from a background that that did things that way. The Thompsons used lawyers to settle their business conflict. Eastham, on the other hand, came from a so-called honor culture where settling conflicts with violence was not only legitimate but respectable. Simply put, Eastham saw nothing wrong in trying to settle a case by deadly combat. Now, this is Frank Thompson's young nephew, George Thompson. A couple of days before the shooting, referring to Eastham's threats, George told Frank to keep the shotgun oiled at home. That was the last time George saw Frank alive. Let's continue with the evidence at Robert Eastham's murder trial. I'll give you a little short summary. Frank Thompson, I say more than a dozen eyewitnesses testified, but they largely agreed. Frank Thompson and a friend boarded the car and sat down. Bob Eastham entered the car and immediately went up to Thompson and struck him in the face. He called Thompson a liar and a coward. Thompson stood up. He pulled out a Derringer and he fired several shots. Eastham was ready and he fired back almost immediately, shooting through his coat pocket. After 6 or 7 shots were exchanged, both men collapsed, wounded, and they were carried off the train. Eastham's wounds were superficial, but Thompson was not so lucky. He was wounded badly in his stomach, and a doctor was called and who advised immediate surgery. Thompson was carried back onto the train and taken to Cumberland, Maryland. This is the railroad station in Cumberland. Frank's parents, Albert and Mary, were notified by telegraph, and they arrived from Philadelphia that night. The surgery could not control the bleeding. Frank Thompson died the next morning. Many years before, the Thompsons' first son, Albert, had died as a small child. Try that again. Many years before, the Thompsons' first son, Albert, had died as a small child, also from a gunshot in a freak accident. Frank's death was, as you can imagine, a terrible blow to this family. After Frank Thompson died, Robert Eastham was charged with homicide. This is the order to arrest him, which you can see right in the middle, the body of R.W. Eastham obtained by you and under your custody and his imprisonment, etc. So he was arrested and charged with murder. Now, Tucker County was split down the middle about Eastham's criminal responsibility. 2 grand juries refused to indict him, but the presiding judge forced a charge to be made. Bob Eastham had the strong support of the powerful Davis interests, and they sent prominent Democratic lawyers to defend Eastham. And on the other side, the Republican interests in the county, who favored new businesses like Thompson's, sent prominent lawyers to help prosecute Eastham. There were more than a dozen lawyers in the trial. Eastham's murder trial began in 1897 in November, and it drew statewide attention. Here's the Wheeling newspaper, and we just take a little look what it says there. The most important testimony in the Eastham case today was that of W.R. Mock, who corroborated the et cetera, okay, who corroborated the remarkable story told by Cooper on the stand last Friday. Cooper is an old veteran of the Confederate Army who served in the war with Eastham. Well, these stories ran every day about the trial in the Wheeling and other papers. Here's a excerpt from, I'm not sure where this is from, it might be a Harrisburg paper. A popular culture of that time was fascinated by Appalachian feuds and Wild West type shootouts. And there were reporters from Harrisburg, as I said, and Baltimore in Parsons sending out daily stories by telegraph. This is an interesting story. Here's first a witness says that the first 2 shots were fired, but not by Thompson, which most of the witnesses disagreed with that. Well, here's something interesting. Ex-Judge Holt, because by now we had another judge in the case, I believe. At any rate, Judge Holt came back and testified to threats made by Eastham against Thompson And indirectly, under the circumstances, the judge sanctioned Thompson's arming himself. And then finally, Albert Thompson, the white, this newspaper was sympathetic to the Thompson side of this, Republican newspaper, in other words. Albert Thompson, the white-haired father of the deceased, then told the story of the whole trouble, which culminated in the shooting to death of his only son, and his recital drew tears from the jury and expressions of sympathy from counsel for the defense, who declined to cross-examine him. So quite a case in the courtroom. And another document that we can look at to give a flavor for the trial, one of the witnesses was talking about things that Bob Easton said about the Thompsons, how he spoke of them in pretty rough terms, it says at the top. I could not exactly say what the language was, but he said they had perjured themselves and spoke of them. Then I said, why Easton, remember this is at Easton's trial, why Easton, I wouldn't talk that way. Those men might fill you full of lead, or I would, or something to that effect, if people would talk that way. Then he remarked, he said he was not afraid. He had tried to insult them and do everything he could think of, and they would not attack him, but if they ever did, that he could shoot 3 or 4 of them before they got him. That's the kind of evidence that the jury heard, and I almost went ahead. So let me ask you, members of the audience, although I can't get any feedback from you right now, how do you think that the jury would vote in a verdict in this kind of case? And what do you think was the verdict? Well, here is how one paper covered the verdict. Not murder, but also not entirely innocent. From a legal perspective, even if Thompson fired first, Easton had intended to start a potentially deadly fight, and that made him guilty of involuntary manslaughter when somebody died in the process, which at that time was punishable by 5 years. It was seen by most people as a compromise verdict. Easton had many friends and sympathizers, and some of these were certainly on the jury. And the presiding judge ended up giving Easton a 2-year sentence. Okay, now you may think that this is sort of where the drama in this story ends, but no, not yet. Bob Easton was sent to jail in Parsons while an appeal was prepared, and then, ever the man of action, Easton escaped from the Parsons jail, probably with some inside assistance, and he went back to Virginia. This is some news coverage from the following year. Colonel, he called himself Colonel, but he wasn't. Colonel Robert Easton, the former Confederate spy, I think this is a Republican newspaper too, broke jail at Parsons, West Virginia about a year ago, returning to his former home near Front Royal. Came back to Tucker County last week to fish for trout. He was enjoying the sport in Beaver Creek, about 5 miles south of Davis, where he lived up to the time of his incarceration, when prosecuting attorney W.G. Conley heard of his presence and sent Sheriff Riley Harper and posse after him. Colonel Easton was informed of their movements, and he hastily left. There are indictments for breaking jail and carrying concealed weapons pending against him. Colonel Easton was given a long jail sentence for involuntary manslaughter, having killed Frank Thompson. So Easton was never arrested. The West Virginia authorities never went after him. And I really don't know the details of that, and I don't think Ron Lewis has ever figured that out, but people just decided to kind of leave it alone. And this is a picture of Robert Easton later in life. He remained a free man until he died in 1924 at the age of 82 after falling off a horse, and he was well known to carry a gun in all his life. Perhaps at times he was haunted by the unnecessary suffering that he had caused, but I just don't know. Well, you might think that we've now come to the end of our real life historical drama, and I guess we have. Or have we? What about the rest of the story? Well, the Thompson family continued in the lumber business in Tucker County for a number of years. They actually purchased Robert Easton's original land, some 500 acres. Then they sold the entire Tucker County sawmill and lumber business to another large operator, Babcock Lumber. this is a picture of Maud Thompson, Frank's sister, who was the only surviving child of Albert and Mary. She continued to live in Philadelphia, helping her father with their business. We can believe that she was a great comfort to her parents as they mourned the loss of their two sons. On her death in 1954, at age 80, Maud Thompson left 3,149 acres in Canaan Valley to the state of West Virginia to be made into Canaan Valley State Park. And when you consider the real destruction that was visited on the forests of this region by the timber boom, things like this was certainly a richly deserved bequest. The Thompson lineage and story lives on in Tucker County in other ways, too. On the right in this picture, next to my wife, Judy Rod of Friends of Blackwater, is Sarah Thompson Fletcher, whose grandfather, George B. Thompson, who we saw his picture earlier, the young man, continued on as general manager at the sawmill after the Thompson family sold the business. Sarah has a weaving studio, as you can see, in Canaan Valley. It's called Ben's Old Loom Barn. And Sarah was one of the guests of honor at our 2019 performance at Cottrell's Opera House in Thomas. That was the premiere of my courtroom drama, Shootout at the Depot, which is based on Professor Ron Lewis's brilliant reconstruction of the actual trial. And we had a number of great witnesses who testified, taken right out of the pages of history. The only one that I completely made up was I turned one of the witnesses into a French-Canadian logger who met a young lady in Tucker County and decided to stay in the county, and I called him Frenchie, and he testified. Anyhow, it was a really fun event, and we hope when this darn virus is over that we'll be able to repeat it in coming years and remember this this extraordinary drama that really crystallizes so much of the history of Tucker County in this era. So as we bring this talk and my presentation pretty much to an end now, I suppose there are many lessons that might occur to us, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to silently reflect for a few seconds each on our dramatic cast of characters. Nope, I forgot Frank Thompson. Well, I don't know, he's around somewhere. Frank will reflect on you too. And let's not forget our Canadian benefactors. Merci, merci. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope we have some questions and comments. And I guess, Colin, we're going to shut down the slideshow. If you're in the audience, I'd love to hear what you found most interesting or surprising in this story.
Yes, sir. Hey, great presentation, Tom. Thanks for all of that. We do have some questions here, but just a reminder for everybody. So if you're on Zoom, if you move your mouse around on the screen, you should see some options come up on the bottom of your screen. One of them is a Q&A. You can go ahead and click that and type your questions or comments into there, and we can address them as they come in. And if you're watching on Facebook, go ahead and just comment under the post, the live stream post, and we will get to those as well. So we do have a few to go here, and hopefully some more will stream in here. The first one we see here, Tom, is, did your interest and pursuit of knowledge in this case begin with Ron Lewis's book, or did you have a separate, did you find it separately?
I think it was encountering Ron Lewis's book that opened me to a little bit about the story. And then when I saw that there was basically Ron was able to reconstruct the trial using some transcripts that were made as part of different legal things, but he also was able to look at all these daily newspaper stories, which would say so-and-so said this and so-and-so said this. And so he did such an extraordinary job of reconstructing this trial. And I've done this in the past. I created a sort of a theatrical piece out of a trial transcript. In the case of the lawyer J.R. Clifford, who had a famous case in Tucker County, and I said, "Well, I could do the same thing with this shootout story." So it really it was Ron's book, but specifically was that exciting courtroom track, because there's just nothing better than being able to use the words of people of 100 plus years ago and have them still have this exciting, dramatic weight. You know, that just as an example of. So that's how I got interested.
Cool, thank you for that question. Our next question is, as a former attorney, what did you think about the verdict of the case?
I think it was just about right, because but I probably would have voted for a more serious charge. When you go out in the world and you're looking to get somebody killed, and then somebody gets killed, I think maybe you could be a little bit more accountable. So I think, from my personal point of view, I would have probably voted for more of a charge, more of like a second-degree murder, made it a felony. See, because involuntary manslaughter is just a misdemeanor. No, that's my take on it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Kathleen asks, is there any evidence that people in Davis or Tucker County as a whole were afraid of Eastham?
Yeah, Eastham was a bully. There's no question about it. Yeah, there are court records showing him in Tucker County being involved in several violent altercations. I didn't bring it up in the talk, but after the Civil War, when he went back to Virginia, he was tried for the murder of a black Union soldier who disrespected him, but he was acquitted by presumably an all-white jury. But the evidence was he was a very violent person. But that, made him able to enforce authority in the world that he was in. And the other thing I would say is that I don't have a very high opinion of Bob Eastham. Ron Lewis's book is a little more sympathetic to him than I would be. The Mosby's Rangers that he rode with did not have a very good reputation amongst the pro-union people in Tucker County. There were farmers who had their horses and cattle stolen by these guerrillas, and there were civilians who were bushwhacked. There was a good deal of bushwhacking both ways, but Mosby's Rangers was one of those guerrilla groups that didn't have any problem with taking out Union sympathizers as well as Union troops in uniform. So I think the answer is that a lot of people were scared of him.
Wow, okay, great. Thank you for that question. Got another question here. Where did you find all those cool court documents?
And they just built a very nice, new, super modern, air-conditioned addition to the Tucker County Courthouse, which is a beautiful old building, but very old-fashioned. And they have a new clerk's office there with everything's kind of climate controlled, and they have archival storage, and that's where I found all those papers. And I'll tell you something about Ron Lewis's book. I didn't put this in the talk either, but he has 500 times as much as I've included in here in terms of original documents. He's just did an extraordinary job bringing out the minutiae of this case. And I think he told me that he came upon the case when he was doing a larger book called The Transformation of the Appalachian Countryside, which is a book about industrialization in Appalachia. And he thought it was a great story, but he never could fit that into his main book. And so after he finished the book, he took all his notes that he'd taken and went back and assembled them rather quickly into this book. But he's done a fantastic job.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we've got a question and a comment here. Justin says, "Thanks for doing this. I enjoyed watching." And he also asks, "How does this story impact Tucker County today?"
Well, you know, the tension, I suppose you could call it, between lower Tucker County down around Parsons and the Upper Valley has always worked out in different historical circumstances, and this is sort of part of that long-term dynamic and continuing part of the lived history of people. I mean, the Civil War was part of it, but it was the agricultural people from down lower, down around St. George when that was set up. There wasn't any industry. There wasn't any big machines or anything like that, and so that changed, and there's been sort of a not, I don't say of a tension, but these two poles in the county, and this is one of the events that helped create that dynamic. I think it's an exciting story, and I like shootouts, frankly. I mean, it's crazy, but these people. I'd rather my sympathy is with those coal miners. It's not with Bob Easton or these other people who aspired to power or the Thompsons and wealth. It's with the people who just did the work on a daily basis, and that's still true in Tucker County. That most people are doing the work on a daily basis and probably don't get as much respect as they should.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for the question there. Got a few comments here for you since he asked for some feedback there. Mark says, "Thank you." And he also says, interesting history. He had heard a little bit about this story before, but he says that you brought it to life. Christy says, "Great presentation." And the aforementioned Dr. Hal Gorby says, "Well done, Tom." So you got some fans out there, Tom. And we will close with this last question. I will say, if you didn't get your question in, feel free to email me, Colin, that's COLIN, at saveblackwater.org, and I could forward those on to Tom, and we could do that even if you didn't manage to get those in during the presentation. But we'll close with this one. Someone is interested in knowing if you would be, oh, sorry, I misread this one. It's about your play, the play that you showed the picture of. They're interested in seeing if you might be interested in doing a Zoom or a digital version of that.
Yeah, I very much am, because we got a script and we got the characters, and it would be easy to put something together. We just have to figure out a way to do it. So I guess I need to look right into the camera and say, this has been a little nerve-wracking, and I probably said more than I should have, but that's just what happens when you go off script. But I really enjoyed putting this together, and bringing this, trying, as one person said, trying to really bring it to life and to combine this fascinating, extraordinary period of technological change in Tucker. The Tucker County played a very important part in. At one time, the Davis coal operations were one of the top 3 in the United States. They had workers from Italy, from Slovenia, former slaves from Alabama. I mean, people from all over the world came there to work and build up this vast enterprise of coal mining and timbering, forest products. And then it crashed eventually. The boom was over. And now folks are picking up the pieces and, creating new lives. But really, part of the tourism, the fabulous tourism of Tucker County, is this industrial heritage. And so Friends of Blackwater has been devoted to, bringing that industrial heritage to life and helping people to celebrate it. And the people from the Tucker County Historical Society, have just been working so hard with the people in the hospitality industry and that sort of thing. And we're taking a hit now with this virus, but it's going to come back. And this industrial heritage and the exciting stories that came out of it, like the Thompson Easton shootout, that's part of the package. the Tucker County package and brand, and it's great to be able to help blow on that a little bit and get the fire stirred up a little bit. So I'm looking forward, to more presentations, more performances, and more combining history with drama.
Absolutely. Well, we got one more question snuck in here. Mark again asks, you said Thompson had a Derringer. Would he have been limited to 1 or 2 shots?
I think it was a 2-shot Derringer. I believe there's a picture of it in Ron Lewis's book. And Eastham had a revolver. Yeah, I read one of the people in the book said that if Thompson had a more powerful weapon, it might, because Eastham was shot in the forehead and it kind of glanced off. So if it had been a more powerful weapon, Eastham might not have come out. But the whole idea of the duel and the code, that was a pretty old-fashioned idea. I really can't forgive Bob Eastham for adhering to that. We don't need that way of settling problems anymore. And just like he was a devotee of the lost cause of slavery, he was also a devotee of the lost cause of settling things through personal violence. For all the fact that the Thompsons had rich lawyers and blah, blah, like that, I guess because I'm a lawyer and I got a stake in it, but I think that's the more civilized way to try to settle things.
Absolutely. Well said. Well, that wraps up the questions we've got here. So, Tom, I want to thank you for your time and your expertise.
Thank you for watching, everybody. You really made my day.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank everybody for joining. Just one more mention that I can squeak in here. We do have a post-event survey that we would love for you to fill out, just so we can know how to continue making great events and how to improve them too. So for everybody on Zoom, those will get emailed out to you tomorrow. We'll also be posting that on Facebook shortly here. Thanks so much again, everybody. Tom, do you have anything you want to promote before we go?
No, I'm done.
All right. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. And check us out at saveblackwater.org for more information about Friends of Blackwater. And thanks again to the West Virginia Humanities Council for sponsoring this event. Stay safe out there, everybody, and we will talk to you soon. Good night.